All right, hey guys. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the reform movement known as abolition. And yes, it's a reaction to the Second Great Awakening, but it's also a reaction to many other movements in American history, and mostly a reaction to those who abhorred the institution of slavery. Because abolition means wanting to end slavery, wanting to free the slaves. Emancipation means specifically freeing the slaves. So abolitionists are very unpopular. And it's not just that they're unpopular in the South, they're unpopular everywhere in the United States in the early to mid 1800s. By the Civil War in the 1860s, you are going to see many Northerners start to become more abolitionist than in prior decades because the Civil War, throughout the course of it fighting, um, it changes in its nature on what people thought they were fighting for. Lincoln even changes what the motivation of the war was when he gives the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, at the beginning of that year. He says that this war was about slavery, but that's not how it technically began. I mean, yes, it was about slavery, yes. But when Lincoln and South Carolina was seceding and all this other stuff was happening in 1861, um, there were other things that were being said, that it was about preserving the Union, that it was about states' rights, that it was about this or that, even though the root cause of all of it was slavery. But that just goes to show you basically how unpopular this idea of wanting to just absolutely end slavery was, abolition. So let's get into it. When our country began in 1789, when Washington was sworn in, there was a movement, inspired by the Enlightenment and the American Revolution to kind of, end slavery. You saw that from like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and other, Enlightenment guys who also happened to be slave owners, regretting the institution that they were part of, and basically hoping, at least in their writings and in their sentiments, hoping that slavery would phase out gradually over the next few decades. But then came the cotton gin. Remember the 1790s, Eli Whitney, the cotton gin. It made cotton so profitable. It was so easy to then take the previously arduous, very tedious task of removing the cotton seeds from the cotton fiber. This machine did it for you. And then you also had the proliferation of the textile mills and the loom technology, right, there in England. Those two things together in the early 1800s basically meant that slavery was going to be around to stay. And then what we've seen so far, what we've been talking about with Manifest Destiny, especially in the South, with like the Trail of Tears, is these big land grabs, and the fight over new states being admitted as either free state or slave state, like we first saw in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This becomes an enormous deal because you need huge acreages to plant all of this cotton. And that's why you get the Native Americans, the 5 civilized tribes, being removed from the Southeast to make way for all of these white settlers to plant crops such as cotton in new states such as Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, even as far as Eastern Texas. This will take root. So that's a little bit of the history here, and we haven't talked in detail about like what slave life was like. There are some amazing movies. They're on our extra credit list. I would highly encourage you guys to check out. 12 Years a Slave is really good. If you want to get kind of a close hand, somewhat accurate look at slavery in America. There's many other movies that depict it, and sometimes they're exaggerated or whatnot, but slavery was terrible. And by this time in the 1800s, because you have some states such as South Carolina where over half the population was enslaved, you're starting to see really strict slave codes. Remember, they brought them over from Barbados, and with that high number of African Americans, the white population was pretty nervous about slave revolts. In 1831, you have Nat Turner's slave revolt, where Nat Turner, the slave, he leads other slaves throughout Virginia in a big revolt, and there were over 60 white Americans killed, mostly women and children, on the plantations while the men were away. Before that revolt was finally put down and Nat Turner was executed. That single revolt, and there were others before. Remember, we talked about the Stono revolts, earlier in the colonial times, and there were others as well. But the Nat Turner revolt in 1831 really scared Southerners. It really did. And so you see very harsh slave codes being enforced after that. You're going to see literacy being banned throughout basically the entire South, that it was illegal to actually to permit a slave to learn how to read or write. And if you think about that, that's insane. But for them, it made sense. Reading and writing are the gateway to knowledge, and knowledge, being able to spread knowledge, that is a tool that slaves could use in their resistance to foment a revolution or to escape slavery. Reading and writing are very powerful. And so to prevent that, they made literacy illegal for slaves, for any African American person at this time. Let's see, other black codes. You have slave patrols becoming very big after Nat Turner's revolt. So into the 1830s, 1840s, especially after the compromise in 1850 and the fugitive slave law, you're going to see all these patrols going around different counties throughout the South. These white slave owners and their kind, it kind of starts to resemble. We don't have the KKK yet. The Ku Klux Klan, they will come about after the Civil War. But that is the beginning of them. They would go around looking for escaped slaves. There would be all these signs for fugitive slaves and rewards given and other things. Many slaves, they would try to fight back in whatever way that they could, but the tide is stacked against them. They don't have the weapons, they don't have the organization, they're kept in the dark, like literally not being allowed to read or write. So they're very isolated. Remember, their family ties are cut, and this is where we get the term chattel slavery. Chattel being like referring to like how they were treated, that they were treated as livestock instead of as human beings. And this was a purposeful dehumanization that occurred from the time a slave was born through their entire upbringing, that they were not treated as a human. Their humanity was taken away by many different approaches, but basically they would be beaten, or they would be neglected, or they would have their family taken away from them as soon as possible. They would not be raised by their parents oftentimes. Usually they're sold away. The slave auctions, even though the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in 1808, you still had more than ever the internal slave trade happening at these auctions. So families would be ripped apart. It's hard to imagine all this, but again, there are a lot of really good documentaries and movies that cover this stuff. So abolition, people that wanted to end the practice of slavery and to free the slaves, they were seen as very, very unpopular in the North and in the South, of course, because the Southern economy now by the mid 1800s rests entirely basically on this cheap slave labor. And if it was taken away, that would topple the entire system that the South had. And the Southern system is basically an oligarchy by this point. Okay, you have the rich few planters on top. They each own about over 100 slaves apiece, huge plantations with hundreds of slaves. And that was the privileged, top percent of Southerners who basically controlled the politics of the South. Then you had, I wouldn't say middle class, but you had smaller scale white farmers in the South, those who maybe owned 10 or less slaves. And they were kind of middling level, but aspiring to be one of the wealthy planters. And then you had the yeoman farmer. And this was the majority of the white Southerners. This was the majority of the Southern population were these yeoman farmers, basically subsistence level, poor white families who did not own slaves because they were too poor to. So that's what we mean by yeoman farmer. It's a poor farmer. They don't own slaves. But yet they were complicit in supporting this slave-based economy, even though they didn't own slaves, and were basically being controlled by the wealthy planter class. You know, they had no say in the politics. It was all the wealthy planter class. So you might be asking, like, well, why did they agree to slavery then if they weren't benefiting from it in any way whatsoever? Well, okay, basically racism. Okay, aspiring social status. I guess you could also see that approach as well, maybe that perspective. That basically they see these uber wealthy, just obscenely rich families. You know, the wearing the beautiful ball gowns, the Scarlett O'Hara, and all this, oh, the Southern damsels, right? And then all this pageantry of this Southern culture of the elites. And they aspire to one day hopefully get to that, even though that's not really going to be possible with the way the Southern economy worked. The other thing I said is racism, and the idea that, hey, even if they were super, super poor and treated like trash, it's where you get the term like white trash, at least they were not the lowest of society, who were the African Americans. At least they had their white skin. And so that was something for them to hang their hats on, so to speak. But it is important to understand that not everybody in the South owned slaves. In fact, it was very few that owned these massive amounts on these massive plantations. And they very, very strongly, vehemently are going to do everything they can to defend their way of life so they don't lose their immense plantations and their wealth. And that meant, you know, getting very upset at anybody who talked about potentially trying to free slaves. And that's the abolition movement. Some of the first abolitionists in America were the Quakers. Remember William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania, the shaking of the hand instead of the bowing and the curtsying. That's the Quakers, because they were a society of equals. That's why they did the handshake instead of bowing or curtsying. And from there, you will have, like I said, some Enlightenment ideas, but then the cotton gin. And then we start to see a few escaped slaves and some very important pamphlets go around. And then in 1833, you're going to get this man right here, William Lloyd Garrison, who's going to start publishing an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And that is going to be so important for spreading the word about abolitionism. And of course, excuse me, you also have the Second Great Awakening and the religious element. The ministers are going around, especially in the North. The Second Great Awakening was really powerful, especially along those canals and transportation highways at this time, which was, you know, mostly canals and where steamships could go. And especially there in New York at the Erie Canal, you had this one, you know, western section of New York that traveling ministers had gone back and forth preaching to the masses in these big outdoor revivals, getting them all religiositied. And so much so that that area of Western New York was called the Burnt Over District. And we talked about one of the ministers that was very, very important at this time, Lyman Beecher, and the beginning of the temperance reform movement that came out of this. Well, the other really important minister you need to know about for the Second Great Awakening and also for the reform movement of abolitionism is Charles Grandison Finney. And Finney and Beecher really didn't see eye to eye, especially when it came to the role of women in the church. Finney was much more of a, I guess you could say he was more of a feminist, because feminism is the idea of women should be equal to men, women's equality. And he actually, Finney promoted female ministers, which was very rare for this time. But he was a big believer and champion in equality, and that was layered into many of his sermons in this burnt over district of New York. Kind of centered, if you wanted to know like where we're talking about, like think Rochester, New York. If you know Mr. Flagging, the other dual credit history teacher here at our high school, he's actually from Rochester. So there you go. But basically that's Charles Grandison Finney, and he's going to go on to help found and then become the president for many, many years of Oberlin College in Ohio. And Oberlin is a very important school because it's the first college in the United States that's going to accept African Americans. In 1835, they will accept Black students. And then 2 years later, they're going to be the first college to actually accept female college students. So Oberlin College, very revolutionary, and a lot of its faculty, staff, and students were big on the Underground Railroad, the abolitionist movement, all sorts of things championing equality. Oh, I think also I forgot to mention with the Second Great Awakening, the Oneida community, really great silverware with them, but also, well, there's a lot of different groups that we didn't have time to mention with the Second Great Awakening. I think I'll probably try to circle back and talk more about the Mormons when we get closer to Utah's statehood. But let's move on and discuss more about the institution of slavery and how people tried to get out of it. I mentioned there were other forms of resistance besides just actually revolting and trying to kill your masters, like Nat Turner's revolt. One of the things that many slaves would do that was more of a passive form of resistance is they would just not work as hard, or they would, purposely sabotage the machinery, like the cotton gin. Oh, well, it broke, don't know what to do, right? These forms of passive resistance, might seem like not much, but, it was all that they could do, and it adds up together. It's going to make what was being done to them much more difficult. And then there were those who will try to run away. Now, there is a big difference between the border states of the South, states like Maryland and Missouri and Tennessee and those states, and Kentucky, that had a lot of slaves, versus like the deep South, states like Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and even Texas. Those states are the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And if you're in the deep South, it was much, much more difficult and much more dangerous to escape slavery. So most of the slaves who are going to be able to successfully run away to the North will be from those border states that were closer to the North. It makes sense. And of course, the most famous method of escaping was called the Underground Railroad. Not actually a real railroad, keep in mind, okay? I know you probably learned about this in the 8th grade, but I have had to remind students about this before. It's not actually a real railroad. But it was a network of homes, stagecoaches, wagons, wagon drivers, boatmen, okay? People who were sympathetic to runaway slaves, people who were abolitionists wanting to end slavery. They were on this network. So it's the network of people, of abolitionists. And if you were a conductor on the Underground Railroad, such as Harriet Tubman, you would know who was basically part of the railroad, whose house to stop at, who was there to meet you, and hide you inside their wagon as you went across these checkpoints, who had a boat that could ferry you across this river. And so that was the Underground Railroad. Now, there are some slaves who will escape down to Mexico. There were some slaves that will go all the way to Canada. But many of them will end up in the northern states of the United States. Because like I said, at this time in the mid 1800s, most of the northern states have gradually emancipated, and slavery is over in the northern states. The fugitive slave law, by the way, I mentioned earlier in 1850, that is going to require northerners to basically, by law, by federal law, report and help to recapture any escaped slaves that had escaped up to the north. And that was something in particular that outraged northerners, that brought the issue of slavery directly into their houses where they hadn't really had to consider it before. Now they're being made complicit members in this terrible institution, this peculiar institution, as it was called. So Harriet Tubman, she is known as Moses because she ferries her people to safety. And she was born in Maryland on a plantation. She was born a slave. When she was just a little girl doing an errand for her master, she was walking by the shed, and an overseer threw a like 2-pound brick at a slave that was he didn't deserve it, whatever was happening. He threw this brick at a slave, and it ends up accidentally striking this young Harriet Tubman instead in the head. And so that caused her many ailments for the rest of her life. But the most famous was narcolepsy, that she would just, that's when you just randomly, you can't help it, you fall asleep. Like I could be in the middle of talking and just, that's narcolepsy. And so ever since sustaining that injury, she would have these random bouts of just falling asleep. And she also attributed that to like visions from God, that she was put on this path. When her master dies, and she feared that she would be separated from her husband and her entire family, as the wife of the master was going to sell off all of her slaves, that's when Harriet Tubman decided to run away to the north. And eventually she goes back 13 times, and she's going to free over 70 of her own family and friends, and over, I think, 300 by the course of her lifetime on the Underground Railroad. But she freed her husband, she freed her children, she freed her parents, she freed many slaves. But again, these were these border states. And so that's why she's known as Moses. But that's not the end of her story, actually. Harriet Tubman's an amazing woman. She goes on during the Civil War to actually play a crucial role for the Union, for the North. She served as a scout. She served as a spy for the North. And in 1863, she actually was the first woman, like black or white, ever to lead a United States force into battle when they went in South Carolina to a plantation, and they freed all the slaves there. Over 700 slaves freed during that raid that Harriet Tubman led as a military engagement. It's pretty awesome. After the war, she will fight to be given her veterans' rights, and eventually she will get $20 a month for being a veteran of the Civil War, having fought in it. She will also, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, she's very pleased, but she was dismayed, like many, that the 14th and 15th Amendments kind of ignored women, women of all colors. And so later in her life, she takes up the mantle of fighting for women's suffrage. And she helped also get awareness and help raise funds and help get built many schools, libraries, and hospitals for African Americans. So that's why we celebrate Harriet Tubman. And we should celebrate her more, honestly, for all of those amazing achievements that she had and all the work that she did. She deserves more recognition, especially when you consider the kind of people that get recognition in America. Why isn't she one of them? And that brings me to the debate we have today, going on still in 2020, over the $20 bill. See what I did there? The $20 bill is actually the one with the face of Andrew Jackson on it. And that's really kind of ironic because, remember, we've talked about this in our class. Andrew Jackson was the president who waged war against the National Bank and killed it. And yet he is on He is on the money of the institution that he helped to kill. It's very ironic. And so there was proposals by Treasury Secretary under Barack Obama, Jack Lew, in 2015 to remove Andrew Jackson, or even have Andrew Jackson on like the back of the bill, and have Harriet Tubman, an American hero, be on the front of the $20 bill. And that was supposed to happen, I believe, in 2021. But it has not yet happened. The Trump administration has said that they're not comfortable removing Andrew Jackson, who, by the way, Donald Trump is a big fan of Andrew Jackson, from the bill, and putting Harriet Tubman on there. So it has been basically delayed. And I think the latest, I'm filming this in October of 2020. The latest I've heard is that they're now thinking about putting Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill and printing those off in 2028. So we'll see what happens with that. Okay, we are going to end the lecture there because there is a lot to talk about with abolition. So don't worry, we're not done talking about it yet, but I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Thank you guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.